Amen. We have been talking about, and we're really going to do this maybe just this week, and we might have to hold it over some of it for the week after the lectureship. But we've been talking a lot for the past 3 weeks about the seed promise. And we went all the way back to when sin entered into the world. Then God made the promise that He was going to send His seed, and Satan's seed was going to bruise his heel, but the seed of the woman was going to bruise his head. And then we started talking about, almost immediately, it seems, at least as far as we read in our Bible, don't know exactly how many years passed between all of these things, that seed was in danger. Cain killed Abel, but then they had Seth. And he was going to be the appointed one. And then we traced that, and we came all the way to the flood. Again, the seed's in danger again. And let's just see how well you paid attention. After the flood, of course, you had Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Does anybody remember which of those sons the seed line develops through? Shem. Good job. Absolutely. And so in his bloodline, we see a man by the name of Eber, and then a man by the name of Terah. Why is he important? Sometimes you wonder, why do you mention all these names? Just try to make it difficult for us to read sometimes. You have all these things. Why is Terah in there? That's right. He was Abraham's father. So it's bringing us to that lineage until we get to Abraham. Then Abraham, in Genesis chapter 12, that seed promise is reiterated to him. In thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Was that designated just to Jewish people? No, it was all nations of the earth were going to be blessed. And so then we started to trace that. We saw again where it started to get in danger. Remember Abraham and Sarah when they came into Egypt? What did Abram instruct Sarai to do? That's right. Lie. Say that you're my sister. So, because he'll like you, he'll like the way you look, and he'll take one of those. Well, suppose Pharaoh would have gotten a hold of her and they would have children together. Well, you see, it's in danger. So God protects him. Remember how He punished Pharaoh. And not to recap everything that we've talked about, well, we trace that all the way through, including the Gentiles. And then we saw Romans 16:20, Galatians 4:4, and then especially Galatians chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. And we tried to hit this home, and we're going to try to probably hit it for the next couple of weeks as well. Was this just to protect Abraham? Is Abraham the most important person in all of this? In Galatians chapter 3, it makes it plain who is the seed that God's been talking about this whole time. It's Christ. Christ is the one in that seed. He's the seed. Through Him, all nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And so we read about these Bible heroes. We read about people like Abraham. We read about people like Noah and Moses and all of these great people. And sometimes we focus so much on them. And this is the point of this study, that we forget we're talking about Jesus. Yes, even all the way back in the Old Testament, we're talking about the one who is going to save our souls. And that's such an important thing to remember when we study the Bible, whether we're studying the Old Testament or the New Testament. So Galatians chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. And then we started to trace when some of the more perils that they came into. Remember also in chapter 15, he reiterated the seed promise. Remember Abraham said, I'm getting old. There's nobody in my house except my chief steward. Is he the one through whom this seed is going to come? And God says no. And then the very next chapter, what was Sarai's idea? With Hagar? And was Ishmael supposed to be the one through whom the seed would come? No, he was not. And so God took care of that as well. Then the next chapter, we continue to read all of these things that take place. He changes his name to Abraham instead of Abram. Abraham means a father of a multitude. And then chapter 20, Abraham and Abimelech again. And then chapter 22, chapter 21, the sigh of relief, we read about the birth of who? The birth of Isaac. He's the one. And then chapter 22, what did we study last week? What did God instruct him to do? Sacrifice him. Sacrifice him. And God stopped him. We talked about the similarities between Isaac and Christ, him being a type of Christ. And so then we went on and we traced that a little bit more, and we didn't spend much time on this last week. We won't spend much time on this. God reiterated that promise with Isaac, and then later on, which of Isaac's sons did God reiterate that to? To Jacob. Remember, Jacob had some problems with his wives that he got too. He didn't get the one he bargained for first, did he? But he ended up getting the one that he wanted. And so through her would come the next son. What was his name going to be? That's right, Judah. We want to say Joseph because he's the one that the rest of what we're going to study tonight really focuses on. And so since he's the most popular one, almost sometimes mistakenly, we forget Joseph is not the one through whom the seed is going to come through. Who's it going to be? It's going to be through Judah. And so that's what we're going to see tonight. And we're going to cover years of history tonight in a very short amount of time. So turn to the book of Genesis. And so Judah is going to be the promised one. And it kind of took away the question I was going to ask. If this is all about the seed promise and the preservation of the seed, the lineage leading us to Christ, then why in the world does the rest of the chapter have to do mostly with Joseph? Well, there's a reason for that, isn't there? Don't answer that question yet. Turn to chapter 37. So you have the 12 sons of Jacob. He also had a daughter. What was her name? Dinah. All right. So chapter 37, and we're just going to recap this. This is not going to be the main focus. But you know, one of the things that I learned a few years ago, and I don't know if there's anybody here tonight that this applies to, but don't just assume that every adult knows all the Bible stories that you probably learned when you were a child. If you were raised in the church, if you were brought to Bible study, well, Noah, I mean, you've known him all your life, haven't you? You've known who Joseph is. What do you think of first thing when you say Joseph? His coat of many colors. Where did you learn that? Well, you've just always known that. I was studying with a young man who's now a gospel preacher, just a great, great, great man. Several years ago, we came in contact. His mother had been unfaithful his entire life. She had obeyed the gospel before I'd ever come into the picture and started preaching at Town Acres. And so she was unfaithful her son's entire life. And so he didn't grow up going to Bible study, didn't grow up going to worship. And so we started some Bible studies together, got a Bible study with him, and I started, and I would mention people like Noah and Moses and Abraham. And, you know, he thought Moses built an ark and things like that. And so we ended up going all the way back and started talking about some of those Bible stories, Bible accounts that we learned when we were young. And it was so enjoyable teaching him those things because his eyes were just wide in amazement, you know, putting those stories together. So we're going to recap this because probably 95, maybe more than that, know this account very, very well. But just in case there's a couple people here, or even one person here who doesn't know this, let's recap very quickly the story of Joseph. Yeah, that's right. That's true. That's true. You learn things every time you go through something like this, don't you? All right, let's start in chapter 37. And Joseph has his dreams. And what did he dream? Do you remember? You can go ahead and be looking at this, and you can even look at your Bibles and answer the question. What did he dream?
The sheaves.
The sheaves. What about the sheaves? Yeah, the sheaves. What did the sheaves do? What's that? All right. Look at verse 7. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheep arose, and also stood upright, and indeed your sheep stood all around. And what did those sheaves do to his sheep? They bowed down. You think his brothers, most of them, in this case, all of them who were older than him, do you think that they liked that? No. Well, we know they didn't. We're going to see that. They hated him. Then they dreamed another dream, verse 9. Look, I've dreamed another dream. At this time, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Who's the sun and the moon? His parents. My parents and all my brothers, they're all bowing down to me. Verse 11, his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in his mind. Starting in verse 12, his brothers hate him because of this. And you remember, they were out working, and what does Jacob send Joseph to do? To check on him. So Joseph goes and he does this. And what was their first plan with Joseph? What did they want to do? They wanted to kill him. What did they do instead? Let's back up. Who stopped them from killing Joseph? Reuben did. Reuben was the oldest, wasn't he? You would think he would be the one through whom the birthright would come and the seed promise would come, but that wasn't how it was. So he stopped them from doing this. So what did they do instead? What did they do while they were thinking about what to do with him? Threw him in a pit. Threw him in a pit. That's an interesting tidbit there. Threw him in the pit. So Reuben was gone. And what did they do with Joseph? What did they decide to do? They sold him into slavery, didn't they? Sold him into slavery. And there's so much information in here. But go to chapter 39 that we're just missing. Remember, again, I've told you this every week. This is not designed to be a verse-by-verse study. It gets frustrating, I know, because there's so many things that we're having to skip over. But chapter 39, where does Joseph end up? He ends up in Potiphar's house. Where does Potiphar live? In a palace in what country? He's in Egypt. There you go. In Egypt. Now, this is going to be an important thing, and we're starting to see why we're focusing on Joseph when the seed promise is not through him. So Joseph now is sold into slavery. He ends up in Potiphar's house. And what happens to him while he's in Potiphar's house? Before his wife is involved, what really happens to Joseph? Does he stay the lowest type of slave?
He's a prosperous man.
He's a prosperous man. As a matter of fact, what did Potiphar hold back from Joseph? Only one thing. His wife. That was the only thing. Everything else was under his control. Did you think God had a hand in that? All right. So chapter 40. Before we get to chapter 40, what does Potiphar's wife do to him? Tries to seduce him. Does he give in? No. What does he end up doing? Running out of the house, and what does she hold in her hand? All right, so where does he end up because of this? In prison. So he was completely innocent. She said he tried to force himself on me, told her husband that, puts him in prison. And while he's in prison, he meets a couple prisoners. A baker and a butler. Now, this is where I always get confused. I always mix these two up. He meets a baker and a butler. And they both have dreams. Remember the butler's dream? And what's that? All right. Taking it to him. What about the baker? Maybe we need to read some of chapter 40. Look at verse 5. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, each man's dream with its own interpretation. Did Joseph, was he just better than everybody else in interpreting dreams? Who do you think gave him this power to do this? God had a hand in all of this? And Joseph, verse 6, came to them in the morning. They looked at them and saw that they were sad. And so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody of the Lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" They said to him, "We each had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." So Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." Then the chief butler told the dreams to Joseph, and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the cups and pressed them, the grapes, and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days, and within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and will restore you to your place and you'll be put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. Did he remember him? Not right away, did he? Then he tells him he was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, so on and so forth. Verse 16. I always think what this chief baker's, oh man, that's pretty good. You know, I'm going to get out of here in 3 days. Look at verse 16. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. So you can just tell he's excited. Boy, this is going to be good. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Okay, yeah, all right. What about it? Verse 19, within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. That's not nearly as good as the other dream, is it? Not nearly as good. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Until we come to chapter 41. We won't read much here. So here we come to Pharaoh's dreams. What did Pharaoh dream? He had this dream. He asked everybody in his court to interpret those dreams. They couldn't do it. What did Pharaoh dream?
7 fat calves and 7 skinny calves.
7 fat cows, 7 skinny cows. What happened to the...
skinny cows devoured the fat cows.
Okay. And then he had another dream. What was that? The stalks? Corn. That's right. That's exactly right. And so finally they remembered Joseph. Joseph was brought to Pharaoh. And what was the interpretation of that dream? That's right. You're going to have 7 years of what? Plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. So one nation, think about this, and that whole region was privy to information that nobody else knew. That's right. And it just so happens that it was Joseph whose father had that seed promise reiterated to him, and one of his sons would also have it reiterated to him. Could there possibly be a connection? Could there possibly be a connection? All right, so we're skipping through. We're spending more time on this than I wanted to. Imagine that. Joseph's brothers. What ends up happening to them? Let's speed this up. That's right. They've got to come to Egypt because the drought is so severe. You know, they had the 7 years of famine. What's Joseph do? Stores it up. Man, stores it up. And buddy, oh, I just wish I could tell when I was still farming what was going to be a good year, what was going to be a bad year. You know, there's always that magic time. When do you sell your beans? When do you sell your corn? It just kills you when you sell them one day for a certain amount and they jump up 50 cents the next day. Oh, it just ruins your day for a little bit. But every once in a while you'll sell it when it's high and the next day it'll drop 50 cents and you're on top of the world. But think about Joseph here. He's storing this up. He knows about those. Who's in charge of all of that? He is. You think God had a hand in that? So his brothers come.
Sit by their father.
That's right. Sit by their father. They come, and who do they have to talk to? Joseph. Did they recognize him? No, they didn't recognize him. Did he recognize them? Yeah, sure did. And so he gave them the food, but what did he do? Asked him about his brother? Yeah, found out about Benjamin, didn't he? Did he put the money back in the sacks? Yeah, and so there was, you know, the father didn't want him to go back and all this. Make a long story short, they had to go back again. And he got to see his brother, his young brother, and again we're missing a bunch. But what does Joseph end up doing? He finally reveals, chapter 45, one of the most beautiful, tender chapters in all of the Bible. He makes known to his brethren who he is. he tells everybody, he starts weeping. And you know, all the brothers, they had a guilty conscience. They thought, well, boy, we're dead now. Tell everybody, get out of the room. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself, this is chapter 45, verse 1. Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud. And this is the one that gets me. And the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. How loud do you have to cry? Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. I think I would be too. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. What would you be thinking? I don't know about this. Please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves. Watch this. Because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Why? Just because Jacob and his sons were more special and more loved than everybody else? No. What's he preserving? He's preserving the seed. And so it's just awesome when they go back and tell them that Joseph is still alive. And what does Jacob, how does he react to that? Because I can die a happy man now. Isn't that beautiful? And so then, what does Jacob's whole family end up doing? Moving to Egypt. It's like the Beverly Hillbillies, they load up everything and they move to Egypt. All right, let's see if these preacher boys remember. How many Israelites went into Egypt? 70. How many came out? A bunch. All right, preacher boys, come on now. Listen. 2 to 3. Yeah, that's good. Still teaching the same thing at the Memphis School of Preaching. See? Do you remember how many fighting men? 600? 3,000? Am I right? 550? And see, that's what I learned 20 years ago. I never knew that here. The important stuff, sometimes I have a hard time remembering, but I can remember that number for some reason. 603,550. That's just fighting men. Came out of Egypt. And someone over here said between 2 and 3 million, it's estimated, came out of Egypt. Do you think God had a hand in that? From 70 to 2 to 3 million. As a matter of fact, if we're going to really study the following week after lectures, it creates a problem because now Pharaoh says they're becoming stronger and mightier than we. We've got to do something about this. And so God preserved that seed. And I don't know this, I've never really researched it, and I don't know that you can know the answer to this. But you know, famines, Emmanuel, have you ever seen a famine in Tanzania? Have you ever lived through one? No. They are devastating. And in these countries, especially, you know, with us here, we're fortunate enough to where we can get some from other places, and we're a big enough country to where, you know, Kansas can help us out, or California can help us out, we can return the favor, you know, we've got enough. But you go to some of these countries and just how devastating it is. I mean, people dying left and right. And yet, none of the Israelites died because of that. Now that's pretty awesome, isn't it? All right, for the next few minutes, we're going to fly through these. If you are a note taker, I apologize in advance. This is what we were supposed to spend most of our time on. We'll see how far we get. And so, preserving that seed, and here are just some of, and you might have some others that you want to share tonight, that would be great. Some comparisons between Joseph and Jesus. This is why we spend so much time talking about Joseph. And you know, how many chapters in the book of Genesis are devoted to that account? There's a lot. Here are some similarities, types and antitypes, between Joseph and Jesus. Genesis 37:3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children. And what did God say about Jesus? This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Matthew 3, verse 17. Both were beloved by their father, weren't they? Envy and hated without cause. And we touched on this just a little bit. Envy and hated without cause. Genesis 37 verse 4, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. You know, it's amazing to me what a heart Joseph had with what his brethren did to him. And this is not part of the study we're going to have tonight. As a matter of fact, I was just thinking about this earlier today. But when Joseph says to his brothers, come near to me, and he says, don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. It almost sounds like, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, doesn't it? What an attitude. What an attitude. God help me have half of that attitude. That's a great question. That's a great question. I wonder oftentimes how much these Bible characters knew when they were going through these things. And, you know, sometimes we forget. We just assume Abraham knew everything from the very start that he knew at the end of his life. And that's not true, is it? He struggled, and we see that. And I wonder, and I'll just say this, I wonder, I'm going to think of a better way to say it. So let me just say this and then tell you what I mean. If they were as clueless as we sometimes are about why things happen to us, and I don't mean clueless, you know what I mean. Did they struggle the same way that we struggle? You know, why is this happening? Because when we're going through a problem, when you're in that problem, have you ever been able to see the good that's going to come because you're going through that? While you're going through it? But what happens after you've been through it? You see the good. You see the good. That's right. And why can't we remember that every time tragedy comes into our lives? Or not even maybe tragedy, but difficulties come in our lives. Because we can see it. Oh man, I'm so glad I went through that. I'm so glad that I now know what that's like. I'm so glad that I can help somebody else in this situation. And I'm such a much stronger Christian than I was before this happened to me. And the next difficulty I'm in, I'm right back where I was until I get past it. And so I wonder if they felt that very same thing. Brother Clark, are you going to say something?
We've always determined that God chose the people that He chose because He knew. They may not have known, but God knew what kind of characters they were and how they would respond. And, you know, they never disappointed Him because He knew what would happen. Yeah. Just like Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac, you know, after he had tempted. When God stayed His hand, He said, now I know it. Yeah. That you fear God.
That's right. And you know what? Not only did God know it in a scientific way, who else also knew it? Abraham did, didn't he? Don't you love when you do come through a spiritual struggle, a physical struggle, or something like that, and you're not proud in an ungodly sense, but you come through and say, man, I never knew I could do that. I never knew I was strong enough to be able to make it through that. And so not only does God know, but you also know. But anyway, help me to have that type of heart. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but yeah. Let's see. Got a couple more minutes. Envied and hated without a cause. Oh, that's right. I forgot that. The last one for Jesus. For He knew that the chief priests had handed Him over because of envy. Mark 15:10. They hated me without a cause. John 15:25. That says it pretty plainly, doesn't it? A root out of dry ground. root out of dry ground. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. Who else does that sound like? Who else had a son that we've already discussed in his old age? Abraham did. And Jesus, he will grow up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. Isaiah chapter 53. I tell you what, let me give you one last thing before we, well no, I'm going to say that for another time. Let's go to one more. That's too good to just squeeze into a minute. Now, it's a cliffhanger. Now you got to come back. See, I'm glad I didn't start it. Foretold that he would rule one day. Then behold, my sheep arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheep stood all around and bowed down to my sheep. Jesus said to him, it is as you said, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Matthew chapter 26, verse 64. I've got several more of these. Be thinking about these. We'll pick this up, the Lord willing, the week after lectures. And then we're in for a treat. We've got 2 bells, don't we? Yeah. I ask this every Wednesday, I know. Just keep reminding me. This is why I want you to wear name tags. I told you. We're going to have some really, I think, enjoyable studies coming up. I've asked Tom today, and I don't know exactly what day it's going to be, to come up with some psalms where he thinks that Jesus is plainly seen in some of those psalms. And I was thinking about planning a few weeks ago about where this class would go, and one of the things I was thinking is, you know, the Psalms is going to be a great place where you can really see Jesus a lot. And then I thought, you know, how about asking a guy that's wrote 7 volumes of the book on the Psalms to teach that class that day? And I'm going to feel really badly if he can cover several Psalms in one class like he says he can. That's going to make me look bad, but see, now I can't even get through Joseph in one class. That's right. That's right. And seeing how Tom was around when they were written, he ought to know something about that, shouldn't he? You know, I always forget this is live stream, so who knows who's watching. I'm not this mean of a person normally. All right, let's get ready to study in our devotional and sing praise to God and help me in prayer. Appreciate your input tonight.